So I hope you can hear me. Welcome, everyone. Gianluca is already here. Phil is here. We're waiting for Scott. Hopefully he will be joining. He will be joining from the US, so with the time difference. And I would like to welcome Dr. Gianluca Pescaroli. I hope that I pronounced it right. So he's an assistant professor in business continuity and organizational resilience, director of the Masters of Risk, Disaster and Resilience. So welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So, hi everyone, nice to meet you virtually. I'm Gianluca, and today I'm gonna talk to you of a topic that I really care about and on which I'm doing both research and interacting with stakeholders. That is stress testing for technological failure and cascading effects. So just a few words about who I am, if you're not familiar with it. I work at University College London. We are still ranked in the best top 10 university for Quest ranking. We are based near the British Museum, and my office is in the historic main building in Gower Street. I'm a bit of a professor, but I'm used to interact with all levels of stakeholders. So I work with both local authority, United Nations, European Commission, and I've done a lot of work starting from 2017. We published in the National Disaster Risk Assessment Words into Action Guideline with on UNDRR with Professor David Alexander, of which I've been in the past the assistant. Now I'm one of the closer collaborators. Recently, I contributed to the hazard definition and classification review, specifically on the definition of power outages and blackouts. That was a terrible headache because it gets very political very fast, and I'm gonna have a couple of points on this later. Other things I contributed recently is Science for the Around 2020, the flagship report by the European Commission, to which I wrote a subchapter and led a subchapter on emergency facilities. Overall, I'm always happy to have a coffee with you if you end up in London for any reasons, or to interact. Lately, I'm a bit overloaded because we started the term. We have a lot of students compared to the other years because our topics are becoming mainstream, luckily. So I may be a bit slow in our answer, but if you want to get in touch, do write me an email or tag me in Twitter or LinkedIn. So please feel free about it. You have my name, just add me, and always happy to arrange a chat. So the way I'm gonna use the next 20 minutes, I will introduce you complex events and the role of technological failure, using a bit our previous research and publication, but also our practical experience with stakeholders. Then I will go on the cascading effects and the lesson learned from what we're doing. And then I will propose you a practical approach to stress testing for complex scenario that is connected to other forthcoming work with the UN, with Dr. Igor Linkov in the US, and new stuff coming up in when we have the time. For any questions, I'm happy to take any questions at the end. So first point, complex event. We were used to think in our sector in disaster reduction and emergency management that we had just to tackle, the immediate needs of the come up with emergency response. So the basic human need, both in terms of food supply in case of emergency, MRS, delivery of water, or later on psychological support. However, what we have seen as a trend in the last 10 years, more or less, is that first, we can have concurrencies. Many things happening at the same time. You think about what is happening with COVID, what else is going on. So we can have other things at the same time, and we need to plan, prepare, and act for that. The other thing, though, is we are more dependent than before on technology, and we need to prepare and mitigate disruption that can be caused by anything like cyber attacks, hybrid threats, space weather events. But basically, what we have seen and noticed also with COVID, for experience that we got mainstream, is that the basis of whatever we do, including this own conference, this participation to this workshop, are based on technology. So we have long-range supply, called it global throttling, logistics, and long supply chain, the role of communication, like internet, ICT, or even satellite communication and satellite interdependencies, and energy. So battery, whatever we want, everything we are doing right now as a society is dependent on technology. And what happens is that despite the fact that we are well aware of this, often is not integrated in practices of emergency planning management and continuity management. We are thinking of society based on the concept of high resilience. That means we know things can fail, but it's actually, we perceive that we build solidity, resilience into the system and flexibility. But the context is evolving a lot. And disruption happens. Just think about your experience in the last year, or the photo we have seen, even just the empty shelf on the newspapers with COVID at the beginning, or the increased cyber attack at the beginning of the pandemic with people working remotely. So complex events, this is based on a paper we published in 2018, and it was included in the last GAR and in the forthcoming Global Assessment Report of the United Nations. Complex events are part of our society now. We have concurrency, compound, successive and extreme and simultaneous events. We have interacting risk like earthquake triggering tsunami, interconnected risk, interdependencies, and cascading effects. Cascading effects are associated with tightly coupled system, but it means, if you think about it, all this, what is worst case scenario? Do we have to plan for it? Or I'm just speaking just because I'm paranoid? So the reality is that all these together, we are full of it. In the last 2 years, this became even more visible than before. But we know that low probability, something that is low probability doesn't mean that it's not gonna happen tomorrow. There is no such a thing in our sector like black swan. It's how you prepare and you conceive planning and society. David Alexander was used to say that black swan do not exist. There are just red herrings. And I agree with that, because sometimes, or most of the time, it's just a matter of when and understanding how to prepare for the when. To make a laugh, think about this. You have many of you may have animals at home, my family has a very fat cat that is arrogant. And you never know what is coming out, or you can see it coming, but you deny the possibility of it. Worst case scenario happened. Do you think 1 second about worst case scenario? Concurrency and cascading effects. Anything came inside your mind? The first thing that came in my mind is this. In the last year, not far away, is what happened in Texas in January 2021. Extreme cold in Texas, power failure during COVID. This is the result. So we need to plan for this kind of events, and this kind of events are going to become more frequent than before, but because the physical component of climate extreme, but also how society deal with that, how our technological dependency is at the basis of everything. So let's have 1 second of focus on cascading effects, starting from all the work we did since 2014-15. We define cascading effects as the idea that there is the possibility of the escalation of events, so secondary emergency that you see here, based on things such as critical infrastructure failure. So you have an event like flooding or extreme cold, then you have the technological implication of critical infrastructure failure. So blackout, communication failure, transport failure, and what are the implications on society of it and for crisis management and disaster management. So it's not just the punch itself, it's what come up next that needs to be integrated in practices. And this is far from being done completely or satisfactory level. I will make an example later on power failure, specifically on a workshop where it was yesterday with the London Authority. So to make you laugh, there is one fun picture that I use to think about technological disruption and operational continuity. So the capacity we need to achieve to stay operative during crisis is this. We tend to be focused on the primary threat, primary risk, or primary hazard, depending on your sector. But the problem that we face is that our operational capacity, so the fact that if you are a first responder, you need to deploy, or if you are a facility manager, you need to keep running your estate, it's dependent on technology. For if you're during COVID, we learn our dependency to the plan B, you know, that's intensive, but how many people do have their phone backup? Unless in the UK, this is a minority. So the way of thinking it, this is adapted for our contribution to science for the around 2020. You have to the primary threat, you need to plan, prepare, and consider, but also the disruption of critical infrastructure, both directly and indirectly. So directly, for example, the effect of a power failure on your facilities or on the society you are considering, the community you are considering, the area you are considering. But also the fact that everything is interconnected and a punch on a certain sector of infrastructure like electricity will have consequences, cascading effects on others. So you start maybe to deploy on a localized flooding and you have to deal with a complex emergency. When I started to be in the sector, the example, there was an example that came up. My hometown is Parma in Italy, where they make all the Parmigiano, the Reggiano, and Parma ham. In 2014, they were flooding. Localized one, but big shock for the city because they were not used to it. They had to evacuate an hospital, another facility, but it was still localized. There was, though, a telephone hub forgotten by everyone in the flooding area. The telephone hub was the one on which was the civil protection dependent on. Disruption, first effect, cascading effect, civil protection has to communicate with the Facebook profile of the mayor because the phone was down. The medium-term consequence, or short-term, depending how you see it, 3 million people without phone for days because that was our regional hub, including my parents that were living 25 kilometers from the flooding area. 3 days without phone. And this is less obvious. The way we do it in practice, we always tend again to assume highly resilience of the system, but it's not a matter of rocket science. Let's do the test. When I'm in a room, I ask, raise your hand, but think about it. Do you ever experience a prolonged blackout? Any of you? I think so, most likely, depending on your area. Power failure of any kind. Do you have a working landline telephone? The answer of that, if you're in London, most of the people doesn't have it. In Italy, I don't know anyone that still has it apart my parents that are 80 years old. Do you have an old-fashioned battery FM radio at home? Not a smartphone. So this is very dependent by generations and society. If you talk with my niece or my students now, nobody has it. Not in the smartphone. Why they should? But how are emergency communication delivered? Do we have a stock of cash? Today, I'm against my principle. I don't have it. But what are the implications of not having cash with you, going cashless? And think about the event that you were thinking about, being in a blackout. What is your triggering cause? And if I tell you, what could be a cause of 3,000 failures in 2016 for blackout? Think about the concept. Store, you reckon? In this case, squirrels. But why I'm raising this topic? First, because there is a problem for planning. We tend to focus again on the primary threat. But the point is, considering a blackout, is that you prepare for it. You try to keep the operational continuity. But the problem is that maybe you have a contract for a generator that is not there, and you don't have the gasoline or you don't have the training for it. And if you want to have a laugh, for exercise your lateral thinking, go on this website called Cyber Squirrel. Because technological disruption can arrive for things that you're not predicting. With this map, I saw that there were disruption to nuclear facilities due to jellyfish. Jellyfish, huh? One in Israel, one in Sweden. And I spoke with a colleague of the UK Atomic Authority then, and I asked him, okay, but are you planning for this? Because, you know, climate change, maybe they can change behavior. And the answer was, I don't know, I need to check. So even for a small thing like that, the focus we need to move is from the triggering cause to the technological consequences that we need to face. So the direct threat to life caused, for example, from a blackout, so health issues, water hygiene, and so on. The indirect one, the societal and economic disruption that can come up, and the challenges for operational capacity. Thinking in a perspective in which we can have cascading drivers like a punch that affects one infrastructure and goes specifically in another one, and the compound drivers. So things that happen in concurrency with, for example, COVID, extreme cold, and something else. But again, the basis of everything is how we live society, how we manage, and even the blackout in Texas at the end of the day was a matter of mismanagement, how we deal with infrastructure and all this, how we prepare and how we see worst case scenario. It's not rocket science, it's a problem of capacity, spare capacity. So are we considering all this in planning strategy? Are we considering vulnerabilities or in continuity management, the common point of failure and the possible excursions of escalation of secondary emergency coming up in a certain area? How do technology and behavior interact together? The example of the radio, do we have a radio too? Is this the problem in the context you are considering? If it is not that one, which will there be? Have you or your stakeholder considering the exercising to define the operational priority and the lifelines? It means to say, in case of technological failure, what you need to address first. How do you shift to a low-touch plan B? In many cases, you will have organizations that are supposed to be first response or second line that are highly technological dependent. And all the people that knew how to shift to a plan B, low touch intensive, maybe they changed job, they retired, and the organization itself lost the capacity to shift to a plan B, low touch intensive fast. So technology is not just the hardware of the software, it's the use we have in the context we are considering. Is understanding what information are needed and how to communicate them. So in some areas, yes, it's fine to have still the BBC broadcasting or the emergency broadcasting using the radio. But if you are in an operational context or your stakeholder are where nobody has a radio at home, this becomes a problem. And for example, I flagged that again to my colleagues of the local authorities here, because we did this first studies in 2017, and still this problem has not been addressed. And then, are we focusing just on the most evident technology, or are we considering the hidden interdependencies, in particular in a time of hybrid? Think about Google Maps. How do Google Maps work? How many of you are using it right now? Mostly everyone. I was not using it 8 years ago when I came to London. Right now, take me off Google Maps, I will struggle. This is a very interesting study that my colleagues of the European Commission did on external dependency. And I'm showing you this because even if it's obvious, it's not obvious. So this was done with the NSIP network, so critical infrastructure network. We see ICT infrastructure, electricity utilities are well recognized in terms of dependency. So how you keep your infrastructure running. Then transport and logistics, fine, we all get this. First slide I show you. Health sector, perfect. During COVID makes sense. But then for me, the alarming factor is you see space and defense, just 5. That means this box has been ticked 5 times out of 351 answers. And why I'm so concerned about space and defense? You're gonna see you're gonna see that coming up in the next 5 years as crazy. Space, what you have seen recently in the news about debris in the space, some experiment is that the global navigation satellite system is everywhere. And with the disruption of these, our emergency services can be affected. Think about an ambulance delivering the service or a fire station delivering against a fire. How they get it there? GPS or tracking, just-in-time economy. Think about harbors, how big ships get in harbors, or simply how couriers get from point A to B. They're tracked. The shortages, people, contamination, disruption. You can find all this on the internet. If I can reshare also the slides. But this is all open access things that you can find online or on my ResearchGate profile. Because things like that, these hidden interdependencies is orienting everything, including my ATM, a practical approach. We are moving toward the idea that we need to understand common vulnerability and common point of failure between different threats. So understanding which are the things that will create cascading effects independently by the primary threat. So addressing better the efforts. And what we are proposing lately is a simple 5-step stress testing approach in which we start from basic scenarios, single risk events like flooding, then coming up with concurrency, cascading effect, hybrid threats. So mixed with cyber and communication, fake information, for example. And finally, scenario of raising unknown and uncertainty. What is to say? This is that if you have stakeholders that are doing tabletop exercise, including local authorities with no resources, you can apply that and you can apply your research to these together because we need collaboration. In complex scenario, we need really collaboration and we are all in this together. Most recently, with after our work with the United Nations and a masterclass you may have seen online, this stress testing approach is going to be tied to another one created by Dr. Igor Linkov that is a 3-stage approach that you're going to see very soon published, hopefully. But again, things are together. You cannot think in silo right now. Another small resources you can have for doing this stress testing, we created in 2020 a basic Likert scale for capacity assessment that is being benchmarked to capacity level and resilience level. So if you're doing any kind of assessment with your stakeholder or supporting their work to understand their capacity and power failure, you can do questionnaires or what is in continuity management, business impact analysis, or supporting like criticality assessment, capacity assessment, benchmarking to do you have the resources in place or the practices in place to keep operational continuity in case of technological failure. So I think my time is over. happy to take any question, and I hope you found it interesting. Please feel free to write me or tag me in Twitter or LinkedIn. And I think my time is over, right?
Yes, thank you very much, Gianluca. It was a really nice presentation.